The bailiffs were brutal when they came, thrown out of your own business, the locks changed, the contents of the office already being loaded into a van before you could even make that last panicked call to the bank. Not that it would make any difference, because they could wipe out the office 5 times over and it still wouldn't come close to clearing your debts. Oh, how you wish it hadn't come to this, and with nowhere else to go, you headed home, hoping that you still had one of those, as you were 3 months behind for the building society payments as well. You could feel it as soon as you walked through the front door, a quietness, a coldness, a brittle sense that something had changed. She'd gone. Taken the kids, taken the dog. The note on the worktop didn't say much more than that. This had been coming for years, but the timing seemed all at once cruel and apt. You stood in the middle of the kitchen, too exhausted and numb even to cry, just standing there listening to the hollow hiss of silence where once there was the hum of family life. The doorbell rang. Through a fog of despair, you managed to trudge towards it. You open it and are greeted by 2 police officers. The female one speaks first. "Is it okay to come in?" she asks. "There's something they need to tell you. There's been an accident. It was your parents. Maybe you should sit down." And then you think, at least you don't own a Mitsubishi 3000 GT. Now, this is from the pages of Evo magazine, a motoring journal which I think is one of the best in the world, and a very fine publication all round, it must be told, with excellent photography and very good stories too. They've had many well-known scribes cut their teeth in these very pages. Mr. Catchpole, Mr. Harris, Mr. Bovingdon, and indeed it was founded by Saint Metcalfe himself. However, on occasion Evo does get things rather wrong. Like, for example, that test between a Nissan GTR and a Lotus Evora, where the Porsche 911 won. Or the fact that for some reason, every single month, they choose to insult in a new and interesting way the Mitsubishi 3000 GT. Now, for the last few months, I have been harping on about the Ferrari 550, how brilliant it is and how it was my childhood dream car. And that is certainly true. But if you gave 8-year-old me an unlimited sum of money and told him to spend it on one car and one car only, it would have been a 3000 GT. Or a McLaren F1 LM. You see, in my eyes, at that time, those two were about even. But time, it seems, has been kind to only one of those, and it's not the Mitsubishi. I even recall one year I was at the NEC Motor Show with my father, who managed to bag access to the Porsche stand, and he was quite happy looking at the then brand new Boxster, a 996. I dragged him all the way over to Mitsubishi's stand to show him a proper car, because I knew that Porsches weren't really where it was at. It was the Mitsubishi that was the real star of that show. Now, my father was somewhat unenthused at the 3000 GT and couldn't really understand what all the fuss was about. But you see, he hadn't spent all summer playing Gran Turismo, and he didn't understand how many horsepowers you could get that car to make with just the press of a few buttons. Or the fact that if you pressed the racing modifications one, it would turn the car green, and that made it even better. I was thoroughly smitten with the 3000 GT, or as in Japan they called it, the GTO. I thought it was the bestest thing ever. And indeed, many magazines at the time put it in the same sort of comparisons, where you'd find a 911, a Supra, maybe an RX-7, or perhaps even an NSX. And these days, if you want to buy any of those cars, you're going to have to pay serious money. But a Mitsubishi GTO can now be had for the same price as an old 1 Series. Why is that? Well, probably because both history and Evo magazine would tell you that it was rubbish. Now, it had the exact same amount of power as basically every other Japanese performance car of the time, probably about a real-world 300 horses. However, it also weighed the same as a modern-day R35 GTR, over 1,700 kilos, because it was packed with a raft of innovative and exciting technologies: 4-wheel drive, 4-wheel steer, electronically controlled suspension, power steering, ABS, and even active aerodynamics. Unfortunately, even when new, these systems liked to fail. Very un-Japanese, and fail they did, frequently and very expensively. And the GTO never really seemed to have any sort of performance advantage to offset the high maintenance costs, so it got forgotten very quickly. Mitsubishi probably also realised that with the Lancer Evolution they already had a surefire hit, and back in the late 90s, road-going rally cars is where it was at. That was the car that everybody wanted, and indeed the Evo is genuinely brilliant. But unfortunately, the 3000 GT, GTO and its American cousin, the Dodge Stealth, never really got any sort of praise at all. So, slowly and quietly, they slinked off into the shadows, where it seems they might have languished forever. Now, despite 3 decades of negative press, I still have a real lusting for a 3000 GT. I want to be able to defend its honour. But you see, I've never actually driven one, or even sat in one. That is, until today. This is Charlie's 1996 Mitsubishi GTO MR, and it is a GTO because it is a genuine Japanese domestic market limited edition. The MR conveniently did away with many of the things that made the original car so complicated and heavy, including the 4-wheel steering, the electronically controlled suspension, the active aerodynamics, and oddly, the ABS too. It's still not a particularly light car. The only weight figure I could find was 1,680 kilos. And I have to say, I'm genuinely nervous about this one. I mean, can you imagine what it would be like spending years and years of your life desperate to meet that pop star you always idolised as a young person, only to find out that it was Rolf Harris? That's how I feel today could potentially go. But it must be said, right about now, the GTO is actually really, genuinely surprising me. It's reasonably brisk, but I haven't put my foot down yet, mostly because this section of the road hasn't seen much daylight today and is quite damp. But the car's got a lot more feel than you would expect, and it rides pretty well too. If I'm being honest, I thought it was going to feel perhaps a touch woolly in just every single area, and that simply isn't the case. Now, the first car that it's reminding me of would be, say, the old Mark IV Supra, because that's a vehicle which everyone thinks is a sports car, but truthfully, it isn't. It's a big old GT car, and it's actually a very good GT car at that. So, let me talk you through the GTO as it comes to me. First thing, the gearbox. It's actually nice to use. This being a slightly later facelift car, has no pop-up headlights, but it does have the 6-speed gearbox, which is apparently much better all-round, and to use, actually really quite nice. Now, this car is a recent acquisition of Charlie's. He bought it during lockdown as the gentleman that owned it needed to get rid to get some cash. And I have to say that I think Charlie's lucked out with this one because it feels really good. Now, it's got new, if budget, tyres on it, and the main thing I don't like about the car is the silver paintwork, just not a fan, and the slightly dodgy looking wheels, but they can be changed. The car does seem to ride very high, but it's on, apparently, entirely standard suspension, which feels in much better condition than I thought that it would. The steering's actually got a real nice feel about it too. Actually, it reminds me somewhat of the modern R35. It's not the fastest rack in here, but it's got a nice weighting and a bit of texture to it, and the car does talk to you. Now, it's a reasonably large vehicle, even by modern standards, and currently the way that I feel is correct to drive it is by using some of the mid-range. However, once I'm confident that it's nicely warmed through, it being an old-fashioned turbo and all, I will give it a bit of beans. It's making a little bit of noise courtesy of a power flow exhaust, but in truth these were never ever the most sonorous of units. That V6 up front never made the best noise, and it certainly hasn't gone down in history with many of its Japanese contemporaries like the RB or the 2J. And the people I know who've tried to modify these have often met with, well, let's be honest here, limited success and a lot of broken hearts and engines. If you want to buy a car for modding and getting big power out of, on Gran Turismo it might have been easy, but in the real world, 3000 GT and GTO are not the car to buy. Now, this being a Japanese specification car, the interior is also reasonably low rent with fabric seats and vinyl and stuff everywhere. UK market cars all came with leather as standard, and they were also all twin turbos, and I believe all or mostly manuals. These, like the Supra, were available in a number of different specifications, so many a time I've been searching the classifieds and been catfished by a car that looks pretty good but turns out to be a non-turbo automatic. Very disappointing indeed. It is actually pretty comfortable, and I've got to say, as a GT car, does quite well. Today is its first big journey, and this car is very much a work in progress. I'm going to try not to be too hard on it, but I also feel like it does deserve total honesty, so I'm going to try and strike a balance here. And we've spent so long imagining what a car's going to be like. It's not easy. Of all the cars I've driven on the channel, this is one of them that I've been most nervous about. Not because of what will happen to me while I'm driving the car. It's not like the Murcielago or anything like that. But I'm just worried that it'll disappoint me. I could live with hating it, but I don't think I could live with it just being a bit rubbish. Now, in an attempt to make this a more luxurious car, you have some nice features. Electric windows. You even have an electric driver's seat. And you've got plenty of gauges here. We've got a boost gauge, got oil temperature, we've got water temperature, fuel gauge up here, and you do have air conditioning and a doubled-in head unit down here as well. Off-boost response is actually pretty decent, and to drive at a normal speed, the car is really very easy indeed. In terms of practicality, it can be a thirsty old thing, although in truth Charlie hasn't done anywhere near enough miles in it yet to work out a sort of decent average. Today was its first long journey, like I said, and it's done a quarter of a tank, apparently doing about 80 or 90 miles. However, the tank at 70 odd litres is pretty big, and we don't yet know whether the fuel gauge is linear, because it may well not be. In terms of running costs, they certainly can be expensive. This one, like I said, is fortunately missing many of the systems that like to go wrong, and indeed, even on the cars that do have them, stuff like the active air and so on and so forth, people tended to just disable because it didn't really do actually that much in the first place anyway. Getting parts for these hasn't proven too difficult so far, but it has meant shipping quite a few things over from Japan, which means that although it costs a little bit more, the biggest issue can sometimes be time. So if you were thinking, for whatever reason, as buying one of these as your only car, do bear that in mind. There is some room in the back, although in the tradition of many cars like this, it's not got as much as you might think it should, despite the size of it. The boot is also deceptively small. It looks like it'll be a pretty good size, but the floor is actually very high up, meaning that you can't get the most in it. This car has also had a fairly recent major service, which involves cam belts and alternator and a few other things. Now it's about £2,000. And the simple truth is that if a bill of £2,000 is enough to put you off one of these, definitely don't buy one. And that, to be fair, can be said of any car of this era, RX-7, so on and so forth. They've all got the capacity to throw pretty large bills at you. That was never in question. What is in question is, can the car possibly be worth such running costs? I guess it's time to find out. To hustle, this is a most unusual car indeed. In all fairness, I can see why Evo probably don't like it, because it's not a car that really enjoys being thrashed. This is genuinely a sort of 7/10ths car. Now, the engine will go all the way to about 7,000, but there doesn't appear to be, in stock form, much reward for doing so. In fact, it feels at about 5.5 is where it's doing its best work, and I suspect a dyno graph will probably bear that out. It's got reasonable punch, and at road speeds it's actually really nice to use. You can work that very enjoyable gearbox, and the suspension Oh, the suspension. That is an odd one. It gets very floaty once you get up to sort of more exciting stuff. The grip is actually pretty good, not just traction from the four-wheel drive system, but overall it's okay, but you can feel the mass of the thing. That being said though, it does allow you to flow with the road. You have to adopt a very certain speed to make this car make sense. You just can't sling it around a bend the same way that you can with, say, an RX-7, and definitely not an NSX. As drivers' cars, those are far superior tools, have no doubt. But as a GT car, this one's got a lot going for it. Okay, space is a little bit tight, but then it actually is in many of the more well-respected GTs, Jags, Astons, and so on and so forth. But comfort is good. It's really very quiet in here too, with the windows up. Very impressed. It's not actually that antisocial either. One has to also remember the actual vintage of this car too. Now, if I think of perhaps an air-cooled 911, they do also handle in a way which is quite alien to most modern drivers and cars. And this really does feel like it's of the era. Now, there's every possibility that the suspension is perhaps not in best condition. That wouldn't be surprising at all, given the age of it and the weight of the car. Heavy cars do like to go through suspension components rather quickly, but it is absolutely in no way, shape or form the thorough and complete disappointment that Evo would have me believe. In fact, I think I want a little bit more of this. Unlike some of its contemporaries, the turbos in here run in parallel. They are not sequential, so they come in at about the same time. And Japanese market cars do have smaller turbos than the European ones, which were designed to be a little bit more effective at chucking heat out for autobahn runs. Or so the story goes. I've got to say, this I know is a really testing section of tarmac, and the car takes it extremely well, I've got to say. I think the GTO is actually alright. You've got to adopt a certain way of driving it, which is of a fast, softly sprung GT car. But when you do that, you really actually, genuinely can enjoy it. And that isn't rose-tinted spectacles talking. Not in the least. Mine are blue-tinted anyway. So that, ladies and gentlemen, is the Mitsubishi GTO. Evo, how dare you? How dare you very much? You apologise right this instant. I'm not going to make any claims this is the bestest driver's car ever, because that simply isn't the case. But it also, I think, does deserve a reappraisal. Thanks for watching. Please like, comment below, subscribe if you haven't already, and I'll see you all for the next one. Bye-bye.